What we're going to be unpacking today is not disowning our own freedom, to not mistake the shape that we've taken, our current identity or self-concept, as limits for who we can become. And last episode, we started to explore that with psychology. We started to look at how other people have defined you and how you may have defined yourself from past circumstances, to then start to question that and ask, who could I be instead? And we talked about different tools. This week, we're going to use philosophy and even get into some spirituality to keep asking that same question, to keep pushing the limits of who we can be instead of being defined by the past or who others have told us that we are. So just before we get into the meat and potatoes, this is a 3-part series on identity and self-concept. You could listen to this one first, or you could go to part 1 first, which I will link down below. Welcome to Immersion, 30 minutes beneath the surface. I'm your host, Pamela, and here we explore psychology and philosophy topics to find meaning in the modern world. Let's dive in. We are going to start out with Bad Faith by Jean-Paul Sartre, which can be illustrated through an example that he wrote about. He asks us to imagine a waiter that really personifies what it is to be a waiter, almost to the point that they might be like a caricature or an exaggeration of that. They might seem extremely eager to make you happy. They might be moving very quickly. So their speech, their mannerisms, every aspect of their being personifies being a waiter, to the point that they've gotten rid of aspects of their humanity, aspects of their authenticity, because they've put that aside to be the role of the waiter. Now, we do this in our lives constantly. And it might be interesting to pause and ask yourself, what are areas that you've done this in? It might be at your work. In fact, in many places such as the United States, it can feel like our work almost demands this of us. This waiter is working for tips and has to, in some ways, play the role to earn a living. Something that we're going to get into in a bit is how society affects this. Sartre basically says anytime we do this, we're living in bad faith. So we talked last week about how often we'll overly attach to certain attributes, such as someone who really narrowly defines themselves as being dependable or friendly or hardworking. So while last week we were looking at the idea of having certain attributes because you were rewarded from it in your environment, this week we're asking, in what ways have I given up my freedom by saying that I can't be another way or I have to be a certain way? So it's a bit more present and future oriented. And lastly, before we move on to how society impacts this, Sartre does acknowledge that this freedom can be dizzying. If we truly take in the infinite amount of ways that we can show up in any given moment, our infinite options, that freedom can feel dizzying because often we like to tether ourselves to something. I live in this place. I behave in this way. I interact with these people. I have these personality traits. And every time we do these things to a large extent, we're narrowing who we are, but we're also defining ourselves, which can be helpful to navigate our world. And speaking of navigating our world, the philosopher Simone de Beauvoir demonstrates that this freedom does exist within constraints. For example, she wrote a book in the 1940s as well, where she describes the limited choices and freedoms that women have at the time. And now to fully understand this example, I want you to put yourself in the mindset of a woman living in the 1940s in America, where you could be fired for getting pregnant. You might not be able to serve on a jury in some places or open a bank account. And so she would talk about how women at this time have several choices. They could do something such as lean into what males at the time might want, for instance, to become as beautiful as possible, and then that might make it easier to navigate the world. But you wouldn't be pushing back against or changing reality by doing that. You would be fitting into the current social structures of the time. So yes, we have freedoms. Technically, the women at the time had freedoms to push for certain changes, and many did. But we also have the freedom and choice to go with a path that might be a little bit easier. And an example that Sartre talks about is someone that might say, I can't go fight in a certain war. I think it was about war, but maybe you could even just say to be a little less intense. I can't go stand up for this cause I care about. I have to be there for my family. If something happened to me, I couldn't provide for them. When you say I can't do that, you are in essence lying to yourself and operating under bad faith. Technically, you can, you're choosing not to. And I guess it's similar to the idea of taking responsibility. And it doesn't mean we always have to do what some other being might consider the most morally sound thing to do in that situation. It's just accepting and taking in and owning our freedoms. That's what I believe these philosophers would stand for, and understanding that those freedoms come with restraints and consequences. It's simply the idea that we have to realize that with every action we take, we had a choice, and to own that choice. I think about this a lot through the lens of discipline for goals that matter to us. For instance, I wrote a book called Fit Intuition, Listen to Your Body, Never Diet Again. And I talk in the book about how when you say something like, I can't have junk food, maybe there's some ice cream down the block and you say, I can't have it. It's a lie, because you can. If you're able to leave your house, you can go get the ice cream. The I can't is an illusion that you're trying to convince yourself of. So if instead you take that ownership in and say, I can do whatever I want, there's all sorts of options out there, but I'm going to choose not to because I don't like how it would make me feel or certain consequences that might come as a result of it, then you take your power back. And we can talk another time about how to balance trying to lock ourselves in with certain commitments, but also respecting the freedoms that are available to us. That gets outside the scope of this topic of how we define ourselves and self-concept. But I think in terms of self-concept, before we move on to Hume, Eckhart Tolle, and other thinkers, it could be helpful to pause for a moment and reflect on what are the ways that you've, this is kind of a bold statement, but been living a bit of a lie or an illusion as to who you are. Ways that you've narrowly defined yourself, things you told yourself you can or can't do, limiting stories, because psychology really, a lot of times, particularly with psychoanalysis, is about looking backwards. Not all forms. There's Adler and other psychologists who recommend asking about things going forward, but often psychology says, look, it's okay. You can't blame yourself. There's reasons you are the way you are. But what these philosophers are trying to get us to ask instead is, okay, let's just drop all of that for a second and realize that you can do and be so many things. I'm oversimplifying here, but we're trying to distill some differences. If you take in the freedoms of what you have now, what are ways you've been disowning your freedom? And I think that can be very empowering. In the next episode, by the way, we are going to marry these two approaches. Because the way I look at it is we're not fixed like an ice cube, but it's pretty hard to be completely fluid like water, or if we want to go even further, like if that water evaporated like air and just be anything at any moment, it's not really practical. So instead, how do we respect these things? How do we respect genetics and past backgrounds with also the possibilities that lay before us? That's what we'll be marrying in part 3. But let's keep going with some other thinkers to give different lenses into this idea of this more flexible sense of self. I'm going to read from an article written about David Hume's philosophy. Here is a paragraph now that I think really helps illustrate what we're trying to get at here. Regarding the issue of personal identity, Hume's skeptical claim is that we have no experience of a simple individual impression that we can call the self, where the self is the totality of a person's conscious life. He writes, "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some particular perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never can catch myself at any time without a perception, and never can observe anything but the perception. Even though my perceptions are fleeting, I am a bundle of different perceptions. I nevertheless have some idea of personal identity that must be accounted for. Because of the associative principle, the resemblance or casual connection within the chain of my perceptions gives rise to an idea of myself, and memory extends this idea past my immediate perceptions. A common abuse of this notion of personal identity occurs when the idea of a soul or unchanging substance is added to give a stronger or more unified concept of self. Now, by the way, I'm presenting a lot of different ideas here. This doesn't mean that I necessarily believe all of them wholeheartedly. I mostly want to see what you might resonate with, because this is the beauty of exploring different branches of psychology or philosophy, different thinkers, theories, because something might resonate within a theory, even if you don't subscribe to the whole theory. Like, I personally do feel that people have a soul, but I actually still think that there is something to glean from Hume's point of view. I take this to mean that at any given moment, you are sensing, perceiving, thinking. And so, for instance, when I was writing this script, I wrote down right here, right now I am feeling full. I just ate a sandwich. My left hip feels tight and I feel my butt on the chair. I am excited about the ideas, and that feels like a buzzing, elated feeling in my head, but I'm a little annoyed that I have to get up mid-writing for a meeting in 10 minutes. So what does that mean for identity in the self? What Hume is arguing is that when we keep trying to drill down to who am I, often all we can really come up with is our recent thoughts or perceptions, that we have these over time. And because we can remember other ones, like, oh, I remember the other day I also enjoyed writing and I was curious. So that must mean I'm a curious person and a writer. And so we form this narrative, or as he says, a more unified concept of the self out of stringing these together. And the way I interpret this is he's arguing to not do that and to instead see that we are, as he writes, a bundle of different perceptions. And so whether you decide to take it as far as he does or not, I do think there's something powerful in that at every given moment, there's a bit of a snapshot in time. And who are you in this moment versus the stories you've held on to? If we want to take this curiosity example apart a bit more, I often do define myself as a curious person. You all know this if you listen. It's why I have this podcast. And I remember about a year ago, I talked about reading about otters and how I'm someone that might look up one thing on otters and then end up reading for an hour about them. And that was true at the time. It's a little less true now. I was reading on pigeons today. And as you could tell, also an animal lover. Oh, that's part of my self-concept. But anyway, I read a little bit about pigeons, and then I was texting someone. It was actually kind of funny. It was about the mating behavior of them, because often the males will like follow the females around in New York, and I find it kind of funny to watch. And so I was reading about how do they actually get together, because they generally monogamously pair bond. Anyway, so I sent this to a friend, and then I was almost going to say, hold me back so I don't keep reading about this for the next hour. And then I realized that's a story I was telling myself, that I think of myself as the kind of person that will fall down a rabbit hole and can't get out. But that wasn't actually true. I was done reading about pigeons. I read about them for 5 minutes and that was it. So it's kind of funny because that seems like a very inconsequential example, but I think the point is how pervasive this is. And I think about, for instance, when you're on a networking call or a first date or something where you're meeting someone for the first time, I think often we do fall into these quick, easy narratives to wrap up. How have I always talked about how I changed fields around 25? Because I want it to feel like a clean, simple narrative. When really, if I was engaging with that person authentically, that story that I've always said might not be the actual truth. It's just a thing that I've always said that I can cleanly tie up with a bow. And that works maybe for the networking call. Sometimes it helps to say things succinctly, but it doesn't work when we constantly have these rigid views of the self in our mind versus experiencing ourselves as we are and as we're unfolding and who we are becoming or who we can become. I'm going to read now a quote on identity from White Lotus as we start to now weave in some aspects of spirituality. Identity is a prison. No one is spared this prison, rich man, poor man, success or failure. We build the prison, lock ourselves inside, then throw away the key. This was from season 3, which did explore some aspects of Eastern philosophy and Buddhism. And first of all, I do think that the nuance is so difficult because now people see a lot of systemic issues. The poor man is not poor because he identifies as a poor man and stays stuck. There's so many systemic issues at play that keep people stuck in certain situations. But I think if we look at the quote more symbolically versus for the nitty-gritty substances in it, we build the prison, lock ourselves inside, and throw away the key. Let's think about some of the characters in this show. Whether you watch it or not, you probably know that White Lotus is often about these very wealthy characters at a resort. And then there's people that work at the resort, often in very different financial situations. So it's exploring class. It's also exploring, in a lot of ways, the rigid identities that we cling to. For instance, Piper, the person that gets exposed to this quote, is studying Buddhism. And she falls into a trap that a lot of people fall into when they get into spirituality, which is feeling that they have transcended the ego and they are above certain problems. And then they actually get an ego boost from being spiritual. Very difficult to know when someone's in that trap or not. And every character on this show has a very rigid identity. For instance, the dad as the businessman that has to provide, who will even cut corners and make sacrifices to have the amount of wealth that that family feels that they need. So let's now follow this into Buddhism a little bit more directly. I'm going to read from a website now that I will link down below on the idea of Anatta, a Pali word often translated to no self or no soul. And as this website's saying, it's one of the Buddha's most difficult teachings. He personally, not that dissimilar from Hume, would say that there is no permanent essence of me that inhabits the body throughout life. But he also did not deny existence. He did feel as though we exist. He just felt as though we were the aggregate of different phenomena, such as form, feelings, perceptions, mental formations, and consciousness or awareness. This is actually pretty similar to Hume, which is interesting. I didn't realize that till just laying out these different ideas now. There's a lot within Buddhism and spirituality that I would like to unpack another time. I'm not going to flatten thousands of years of different teachings into 5 or 10 minutes in an episode. I think it could be really special to down the line do a deep dive series with expert guests, explore how this connects to compassion and other ideas, but let's stay focused on how this is connected to self-concept and identity. So we want to loop in a couple other thinkers here. I think if we want to pull apart a rigid self even more, we can ask, who is the I we are even talking about? And Eckhart Tolle has a really profound way of describing this. He talks about coming out of a really deep depression and anxious period in his life. He talks about not long after his 29th birthday, living with a sense of deep dread and not being able to live with himself any longer. And then he said, I cannot live with myself any longer. This was the thought that kept repeating in my mind. Then suddenly I became aware what a peculiar thought it was. Who am I? One or two? If I cannot live with myself, there must be two of me, the I and the self that I cannot live with. Maybe, I thought, only one of them is real. This gets a little trippy, and it is true, is that we have the self that's kind of like mental chatter. And then we have the self that's maybe deeper or under that, maybe more of a true self that's observing. It is something to chew on. You've probably thought about this before. We're in this self-worth series, and someone that's struggling with self-worth might have had a really painful thought, such as, I can't stand myself, I hate myself, I'm ashamed of myself. That does sound like there's two different people there. I am ashamed of myself. Who's the I? And if you've never really slowed down and had maybe prolonged periods where you've detached from external stimuli, whether that's the news or your notifications on your phone, I think that, for instance, retreats, meditation retreats, or times with deep contemplation, solitude meditation, this can give us the space to truly meet ourselves. Who am I underneath all of it? And it's also really important to not condense all of these thinkers into the idea of having the same thoughts. For instance, when I first got exposed to the power of now, I thought that the observer was maybe then the true self. For instance, if you're really jealous about your partner working closely with a very attractive colleague this quarter on a big project, maybe you're vacuuming the living room and you're just in a flurry of thoughts about this. You feel completely consumed by it. And then you take a step back and you realize, oh, I've been really just lost in thought about this and completely not even present with what's going on. And I think I feel threatened because our relationship is not in a good spot. And I'm not showing up in a lot of the ways that I feel like I should. And that's probably more why I feel threatened. It's not even about this other person. And you're only able to see that and take a step back from it through observing your thoughts. Now, some people might say that gap, that awareness, that observer is the true self. But certain thinkers might think that that observer self is simply another part of your personality. And maybe that awareness is closer to your true nature than the thoughts themselves. But even that is still an identity that one could cling on to and aim to release. This is a really complicated topic, and we're certainly not going to get to the core of it in this episode or even in this series, but we can aim to get closer so that we don't rigidly attach to one way of being. That's really the main thesis of this episode. We're getting into the deep end. We've been swimming deeper. No immersion pun intended there, but we're there now. And I just want to leave you with some food for thought. Some traditions would argue that this openness, this way of being flexible in the world is not just a byproduct, it's a clue that our ordinary sense of being a separate sense of self, this really narrowly defined ego, might be incomplete. There might be more to us. There are some thinkers, such as Alan Watts, who would describe ideas such as the following. Think of a cell in the body. We could view that cell as being separate from the body. It does have a defined boundary of sorts. It could be defined separately if we want to split things down into their tiny individual parts. But it also is very much a part of the body. And so some thinkers raise the question, are we actually as separate from existence or reality as we feel we are? With these very defined boundaries, particularly in cultures such as in the United States, we like to break things down into parts, to split and slice and understand. And in doing that, we often do that so much that we lose interconnectivity. This is something that we can get into more another time. But what I will leave you with here is the thought that maybe we're more like a drop in the ocean. So if we're going with that water metaphor earlier, we're not the ice cube, we're water, we're malleable, we're flexible. And if we're deconstructing the idea of the self and how fixed is it, how separate is it, how defined is it, maybe that drop is in the ocean. If we think of it as a tiny, tiny part, that molecule exists as a molecule, but can it really be defined as apart from the ocean when it's also within it? We will work on braiding and bridging a lot of these ideas together next week into some practical steps, because I know that we took a big psychological dive and then a big philosophical and spiritual dive. And we do like to conclude in as practical of a way as possible so that you can apply these ideas to your life. But these ideas are extremely practical, even if it feels like we just took a big jump this week. When we are not narrowly attached to a very firm way of being, we show up more open-minded in our relationships. We are more authentic, more curious, spontaneous. We work through conflict easier with other people. We're less attached to being right. We're more open to many types of experiences and soak in more of what life has to offer. So it is actually incredibly practical. If you are not subscribed to the show, wherever you are listening to this, YouTube, Apple, Spotify, many other players, go ahead and subscribe to the show so you get notified when new episodes come out. And looking forward to speaking to you next week. We release episodes Sunday morning. Talk to you then.